When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Skims or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling and for shoppers buying simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout Allbirds uses. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. Shopify.com/income.
Hi everyone, I'm Deb Flashenberg. Welcome to Yoga, Birth, Babies, a podcast produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. We will be diving into everything prenatal yoga, birth, and baby related, hoping to inspire, educate, and empower you through your journey into motherhood. Thank you for listening.
Hi, I'm Deb Flashenberg, and I'm your host of Yoga Birth Babies, and today we have insider tips from an L&D nurse. I decided to do this episode because I heard some students talking after class one day about should they hire a doula or should they just expect that their labor and delivery nurse will be their support. And it was quite an interesting conversation because one person had absolutely hired a doula. She wanted that continuous support. And she was telling them, because this was her second birth, that in her first birth, she didn't get as much support as she thought she would. And so there was a big conversation. So I thought I should do an episode and really talk about the role of labor and delivery nurses, what you can expect. And now it's going to differ, I recognize, depending on how busy the hospital is, where you're located. But I thought I'd give you some insight as to how a labor and delivery nurse can be helpful, and then some insider tips and some just good piece of advice. So my friend Caitlin Jeanmougin is a registered nurse with 21 years experience caring for childbearing families. She has a master's degree in nursing education as well as a doctorate in nursing practice. She spent 17 years providing inpatient care in labor and delivery, postpartum, high-risk antepartum, and the Special Care Nursery, and is currently employed as a full-time professor in an undergraduate nursing program teaching maternal newborn nursing. Caitlin is a RPYT 200. That's a registered yoga teacher that's been grandfathered in with experience, with over 14 years experience. And she happened to do the prenatal yoga teacher training with 6 years experience teaching prenatal yoga. And she's a certified spinning babies parent educator. Caitlin's wonderful. I've had the honor of knowing her for about 6 years now, and I think she's just so knowledgeable. So when this topic came up, I thought Caitlin is the person to reach out to. So she really gives us an insider's look at how L&D nurses can support people in labor. We talk about epidurals, what you can expect, when to get them. She talks about things that she found frustrating as an L&D nurse, as well as things that are rewarding, and just some really good tips and support for those that are pregnant and will be having a baby soon. So I'm really excited for you to hear this conversation with Caitlin. Before we get to that, I always love to give updates about what's happening at the studio. And I realize really the best way to check out our in-person and online classes, as well as our workshops and on-demand workshops, is to head to our website, prenatalyogacenter.com, because there we've got everything you need to know about our schedule, our workshops, past blogs, past podcasts, all that good stuff. So head over there because we have a pretty packed schedule. I also want to take a moment and ask a favor of you. Will you please leave a rating and review for the podcast? It helps people find us. And one thing I'm really passionate about is getting this information and support out there to the perinatal community. One thing Caitlin and I talk about in this conversation is that taking childbirth education classes has dwindled. We're seeing fewer and fewer people take them. So if they're not taking a childbirth education class, I'm hoping that this free resource, the podcast, can get to as many people as possible, since we really try to work from an evidence-based platform. All right, I think that's it. Oh, the last thing I want to bring up is those that are looking to dive into prenatal yoga, check that out also on our website, prenatalyogacenter.com. Okay, That is it. We're going to take a super quick break. When we come back, please enjoy my conversation with Caitlin.
This episode is brought to you by Coffee Mate. After watching this season of the HBO's original series, The White Lotus, this is the tropical getaway I needed. One more pina colada, please.
Hey, you're not on mute.
Oh, I thought I was in paradise. Turns out it was my Coffee Mate. Coffee Mate Pina Colada and Thai iced coffee flavored creamers. Inspired by the newest season of HBO's original series, The White Lotus. For the love of coffee. Try now.
Hi, Caitlin. How are you?
I'm great. How are you, Deb?
I'm doing pretty well. I have to say, I know you said you're just getting over COVID, and you sound great. So I actually think I sound worse.
I'm glad.
I'm really excited to pick your brain because, as I said in the intro, you were an L&D nurse. Would you say 17 years?
I think I had bedside practice for right around 17 years. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. All right. So you're the perfect person for me to pick your brain. Well, I'm calling this one Insider Tips from an L&D nurse. Dun, dun, dun.
All right. I'll do my best.
So I guess before we get into kind of the details, I would love to learn a little bit. Well, I know about you already. Because we've hung out before, but
yes.
I want everyone else to know about you and why you became a labor and delivery nurse.
Okay. Well, nursing was my second time through college. I have a bachelor's degree in biology and Spanish, and I was planning to become a physician assistant. And life turned me in other directions, and I ended up in an accelerated Bachelor of Nursing program. And I knew toward the end of my schooling that it was either going to be labor and delivery or pediatrics. And I kind of knew going into nursing school that's probably where I would land. But I was in my last semester, and I had a clinical on a labor and delivery floor, and I connected really well with my preceptor. And she was kind of asking me about my plans after school. And I said, well, I'm thinking either peds or labor and delivery. But at that time anyway, it was really difficult to get into labor and delivery as a new grad. So my hopes were not high. But she kind of just walked me down to her manager's office and said, she graduates in December, you should hire her. And that was kind of it. And so the universities, or the universe, I should say, just kind of decided that I was going to be a labor and delivery nurse, at least first. And I never left. So I started there in January of 2004 when I passed my NCLEX, and I worked in a high-risk Antepartum and labor and delivery unit for a year and a half until I moved to Cincinnati. And then I went to a kind of low to medium risk unit and learned postpartum and special care nursery care on top of the high risk antepartum and labor and delivery that I had been doing. And yeah, I never left. So here we are 21 years later, and I'm still very heavily immersed in all things pregnancy and childbirth.
Well, let's keep going into that. So I know you're not bedside anymore. Talk a little bit more about what you're up to now.
Yeah. So I decided to go into nursing education as a clinical instructor back in 2016. And I moved into a full-time assistant professor tenure track role in fall of 2020, which was, amazing timing. But I've managed to survive. And I was still working at the bedside, at least PRN, up until March of 2023. My unit has since closed, as have so many units across the country. And I knew it was kind of moving in that direction when I left. So around the same timing of becoming a full-time educator, I also attended your prenatal yoga teacher training, got my master's and my doctorate in nursing practice. I am a Spinning Babies parent educator as well. So I very much still have my hands in care for birthing people. I course coordinate for clinical experiences for our students, and even sometimes still work as a clinical instructor at the bedside as well. but I've kind of shifted my focus from inpatient care to kind of how can I change things from the outside in.
Well, I love all of what you continue to do. And I know, having worked with you really pretty recently for the teacher training, when you were a mentor, I know how passionate you are about supporting change and supporting people. So I'm really excited to talk to you. All right. So let's focus a little bit of your time today on your L&D. So, and I know it's going to differ from place to place. And the only place of reference I have is the New York City hospitals that I supported people at as a doula. And so it's going to be interesting, as you have from Cincinnati a different perspective. But in general, how much time should someone expect to have support from their nurse? Because one thing I hear from my students when I'm like, oh, you think I'm having a doula? Like, well, we're going to have the nurse and my partner. And I'm like, maybe.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I think it's widely variable, and not just because of, geographic location, but even the care environment where you're having your birth, or the acuity of your own health as the birthing person, or not, if everything is nice and low risk. I think it just varies a lot. And I'm sure you would agree with me when I say that if you are someone who knows that you want continuous labor support, then your best bet is bringing a doula, because that just isn't something that can realistically be guaranteed in today's healthcare environment. We have staffing guidelines from organizations like the Association of Women's Health and Obstetric and Neonatal Nurses, but by no means are those standards at this point. And so even though we know best practice is that when a person is in active labor, that they are one-to-one with their nurse, that is not going to be a blanket statement by any means. That was, frankly, in my experience, the exception, that I would be able to provide that kind of support. So, it depends greatly on nurse-patient ratios. What else is going on the unit? If there is an emergency with another person that requires all hands on deck, that may include your nurse having to go and support that emergency temporarily. Or, an emergency or a very active patient comes in and patient assignments need to change, and you may end up with a different nurse than the one that you started out with. There are lots of things that can impact that. And, one of my frustrations as I've moved through my career is this sort of, I like to call it nursing station nursing, where nurses are, spending more time looking at monitors from afar than really at the bedside, observing their patients. And it's something, as an educator, I'm trying to dissuade, but it's hard in this age of technology. So at minimum, for most patients, they are being evaluated, I would say, every half an hour to hour. And you can for sure expect a nurse to be in there then. But beyond that, it depends. Once a patient is pushing, it should be one-to-one throughout the pushing, the birth, and the recovery period. And for someone having a cesarean birth, it's often one-to-one from admission through recovery. It just sort of depends on how that unit operates. So I know that's not a very specific answer to your question, and
more questions, so that's okay. But
yeah, but it's hard to say because it can vary widely.
Right. And as you were speaking, I was thinking about my experience going in, and of course the nurses were not going to be there probably as much because they brought me to do some of the comfort measures. So, and I realized I did not actually birth in hospital, so I don't know what it would have been like from that perspective, which is why this is actually really fascinating to me. So what I did witness is, like you said, like an evaluation, came in, talked, kind of observed. But beyond, had I not been there as the doula, what in that evaluation time, are nurses typically offering comfort measures or suggesting different birthing positions? And I know that spinning babies and some of the other methods have gotten more popular. How
Mhm.
this is kind of a multi question.
Go for
Do
it.
you feel like a lot of nursing staff are taking to spinning babies and body writing method and all that and that stuff? So how much can someone rely? I guess the question goes back to how much can someone rely on their nurse providing some of that information?
Yeah, I would agree with you that if I have a client who has brought a doula with them, I may be less proactive as the nurse in offering that information for a couple of reasons. First, because they already have an established relationship with the doula. Not that I'm not going to try to create a personal connection with them, but I know that I'm the newbie, I'm the outsider, right? And they may be more comfortable getting that information from somebody they already know. But if I have a client, especially one who's having an unmedicated birth, and I'm able to provide that, you know, truly uninterrupted labor support, then I'm absolutely going to be providing those sorts of, suggestions or offering options. I do think that the amount of knowledge that a typical bedside nurse has in things like spinning babies or bundle birth or just physiological birth in general varies widely. And I think there's a common misconception that your nurses get this information in school or even in their orientation. And I will say that most of my labor support, birth physiology, and coping mechanisms and positions and whatnot knowledge came from things that I sought out on my own, and that I had to pay for on my own and I had to find time for on my own. And I do think that the use of things like spinning babies and bringing classes to the nurses is increasing. I think it's more popular in certain geographical areas than others. And I am in one of the, we'll call us slow adopter areas of the country. Um, but I do think that it is gaining more popularity. And it used to be you would say spinning babies and people would look at you just like, well, and now I think there's at least awareness of it, but how much different providers and practitioners buy into it varies pretty widely. But I would feel comfortable saying that all labor and delivery nurses have received training to some extent in positions and coping mechanisms. But I think the amount of training probably varies really widely.
I think it's so interesting because it then puts the birthing person at a bit of a disadvantage that they have to either hire someone or learn it themselves. And then if you're say someone comes in, they've done their spinning babies and they're ready to do some of these positions. The staff may look at them like, what are you doing? And then not be supportive or helpful about that.
Potentially, yeah. I always encourage my clients who take my parent class to take the photos with them and take the handouts with them so that they can be like, here's what we're doing. Here are the different poses that are encouraged for these various parts of labor. So that, in the heat of the moment, if the support person or a birthing person are not able to focus on that, at least there's something tangible that they can kind of give to their care providers to be like, this is what we're doing. Can you get on board with that? And at least from what I've heard from my clients, that's been really helpful for them.
I would love to see, this is kind of a big wish, that the understanding of the pelvis and positions is something taught in nursing school, because it
Good
really
news, I do teach it. I do. I don't know how many other people do, but like I said, I'm trying to change things from the outside in. So I do talk about that, and just that it's basic anatomy and physiology. This isn't some witchy woo-woo thing that we've made up. It's just something that we've forgotten along the way.
It's really just biomechanics. Well,
Exactly.
I'm excited about that. And a little side note, I remember gosh, this is maybe 4 years ago. It was like really towards the beginning of the pandemic. There was a spinning bee. It was before I could do my parent educator. So maybe it was 5 years ago. There was an all-day workshop I had to go to, and I had to drive in near Philadelphia for it. And I thought there were going to be a lot of yoga teachers, and there was a room full, it was packed. I was the only yoga teacher. Everyone else was an L&D nurse. And that was exciting. I was also, one thing I'd say though, I seem to know the most anatomy.
I'm not surprised by that at all, because I think meeting you 15 years into my career was where I finally went, oh my goodness, and all the pieces fell together. So I'm not surprised to hear that at all.
I was a little taken back. I'm like, really?
Yep.
Like,
True story.
Yeah. Anyway, so let me keep going into little insider tips of L&D. So I want to shift a little bit to just kind of the general job of an L&D nurse. Yeah. And I want to start talking a little bit about epidurals. So what is the general job of an L&D nurse? Because we know some of it is comfort measures and suggesting different birthing positions, but I'm sure there's a lot more.
I think primary job functions would be, number one, monitoring for the development of any complications, whether those are from the birthing perspective or the perspective of the birthing person or the fetus. I always refer to my role as like the oxygenation monitor, monitoring the fetus for any signs of impaired oxygenation or, most people would say like stress, fetal stress or distress. And I would also say education should be a huge piece of what we're doing, because I think that the average birthing person in this country comes into their birth with less education than they would about which cell phone to buy, which I find really, really odd.
Disheartening.
Disheartening is a good word. Yeah. Because it's such a big thing. I
like hearing that the nurses are helping with education.
We have to. It's especially in a post-COVID world, the number of people who are taking childbirth education courses is tiny. It's just really tiny. And so trying to provide anticipatory guidance, it's a lot of documentation. And a little known, or maybe it's a well-known fact, I don't know, but it's one of the most highly litigated areas of healthcare. And so the amount of documentation expected from your nurse is a little ridiculous, frankly, because of that. And it takes up a ton of time, the documentation piece of it, whether we want it to or not. Generally, it's like, I think of the labor nurse as the ringleader. Like, it is a bit of a circus. There are lots of moving parts. There are lots of different things that can and do come up. And they're the person in the middle who hopefully has a pulse on all of it. They are often the advocate. They are often the intermediary between care providers who may not be in-house and what's actually going on in the birth room. Working with other departments that patients may never see happening, like trying to get lab results for a really critical issue, or trying to get a patient down to ultrasound for imaging that they need, or your patient hasn't gotten a meal in a day. Why not? Like, there are lots of other things that are going on sometimes behind the scenes. But primary role is ensuring, hopefully, a healthy passage for the birthing person and the baby.
That's an important role. I like that.
It can look a lot of different ways.
We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, I want to pick your brain about epidurals and birthing. We'll be right back.
Lowe's knows that free is just better. That's why MyLowe's Rewards is free to join. As a member, you earn points towards MyLowe's money on eligible purchases, get exclusive free gifts, and earn free shipping at Silver Key status, all on top of weekly member-only deals. Don't wait. Join MyLowe's Rewards for free today and start saving more. Lowe's, we help, you save. Loyalty program subject to terms and conditions. Details at lowes.com/terms. Subject to change.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Xyzal is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Xyzal keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Xyzal. At night.
Okay, we are back. So you probably have a good sense. You've probably seen hundreds, if not thousands, of epidurals being given. And I want to go through a little bit of the timeline of, I tell this to my students all the time, like, you can't just expect to walk in to L&D and be like, here's my insurance card, here's my back. Like, it's not instant. So a little bit of the average timeline between asking for an epidural and getting it, and some things that might need to happen before it's actually given. And then also, once the epidural is given, how can the nurse play a role in supporting the laboring person? Because we know we don't want them just kind of hanging, laying there.
Right. So the minimum things that need to happen before an epidural can be given, a patient needs to be admitted. So usually that involves either coming through triage and being evaluated to see if it's real labor or not, doing the admission paperwork and questions regarding pregnancy history, vital signs, all that fun stuff, medical and surgical history, signing consents. Blood work needs to be drawn, and results need to be obtained for, at minimum, a complete blood count to check hemoglobin and hematocrit, which can speak to anemia, and platelet level, which is probably the most important one, because if platelets are too low, having an epidural can be very dangerous and result in bleeding around the spinal cord that could cause damage. So we have to get that lab test at minimum back before most providers are going to be willing to place an epidural. And they also like clients to have received at least 1 liter of IV fluids to kind of preload, because we know the number one complication of an epidural is hypotension or low blood pressure. So increasing the circulating volume can help to minimize that from happening. And if the birthing person's blood pressure goes down, then blood supply and oxygen to the fetus also goes down, and they don't really appreciate that very much. And then we can see some fetal distress. So those things at minimum have to happen. If you've been in the hospital environment for a while, the admission is already done. Hopefully the blood work is already done. And I always have a conversation with my patients that, like, hey, when you're starting to think you're ready, let me know so I can make sure that we've got your IV fluid in and you aren't waiting for that once the time comes. Now, the other thing to think about is that in some environments, there is not an anesthesia provider in-house. So they have to be called and brought in, which is usually they have a 30-minute window. Or if there is someone who is employed 24/7 on the unit, what else are they doing? Have they been called to a primary scheduled C-section, or is there an emergency section going on? And then I try to just stay in communication with my patient, like, hey, there's a C-section scheduled at this time. It's about an hour away, but I want you to know if you're starting to think about it, it's kind of a now or 2 hours from now situation. So what are you thinking? Just so that you don't end up in that situation where you're forced to wait when you really, really want it. In a perfect world, between the time a client asks for the epidural and they're comfortable, it could be as low as 20, 30 minutes. But there are definitely things that can delay that.
And paperwork. I remember seeing people sign lots of paperwork.
Yeah. And I know, at least where I have worked, we've already been really proactive about having anesthesia talk with patients as soon as they arrive, and going over risks and benefits and signing consents then, before they're super, super uncomfortable and not able to kind of focus on the conversation as much. But I know that may not be the practice everywhere.
Yeah, I just remember seeing people like trying to do all at once, and someone's like signing away. I'm like, do you know what you signed?
Right.
So now, say someone gets there. First of all, thank you for mapping that out, because I do think it's important for people to have a big sense of the big picture, because as we talk about, we talk about this in prenatal yoga, you have to have coping skills because you don't know when or how quickly you can get an epidural should you want one. And like you said, sometimes the anesthesiologist is not available.
Right.
So when someone chooses to get that and they have it and they're more comfortable, as an L&D nurse, what are your suggestions, as well as what are the common practices that, like, since you're proactive, my guess is you were pulling out the peanut ball and doing different positions, but that's you. What do you see? And maybe that's others, but what do you think the common practice is once the epidural's given, and then maybe suggestions to our listeners of what might be helpful?
Yeah. So the research, let's start there with what we should be doing. The research says that someone with an epidural should have a position change every 20 to 30 minutes in order to promote optimal fetal descent and optimal fetal position. Now, certain positions become really difficult once somebody has an epidural because their motor skills go way, way down and their ability to support their weight goes way, way down. Also, sometimes by this point, the birthing person's exhausted and they want an hour or two nap. And if that's the priority, then you know what? I'm going to find a good position and leave them there. Let them get a power nap, and then we'll start the every 30-minute rotation. If I had to guesstimate, I would say average patients are having their position changed every, depending on the time of day, every hour, maybe sometimes 2 hours. I do think that the use of things like a peanut ball has massively improved over the last 10 years, especially. And there are still lots and lots of positions that can be accommodated with an epidural. Maybe it looks a little bit different, but the same basic concepts can be achieved. But again, it kind of depends on patient willingness. And so from a patient perspective or a birthing person perspective, I would just say, make sure your nurse knows that you are on board with changing positions regularly. Because sometimes they'll be like, oh, I just got to sleep. Do I have to move again? And I'm obviously not going to force somebody, but just know, ideally, every 30 minutes, we should be doing a different position. And just doing a tiny little tilt from one side to the other doesn't really count. But I do see that regularly.
Well, maybe explain why you and I are like, position changing is important. Because sometimes, again, if the person's coming in and they haven't had the opportunity or chose not to do a childbirth ed, they may not understand that position change is important for facilitating, well, I'm about to say it for babies, descent and rotation. So can you just talk a little bit about the peanut ball and how adjusting the legs can help?
Yeah, so we know that internal and external rotation or asymmetrical movements with the lower extremities changes the shape of the pelvis. And as the baby is descending through the pelvis, the part of the pelvis that we want to open up changes. So it's not like we just do this position all the time, because it's only going to work when the baby is at that particular level of the pelvis. So really high level, when the baby is high in the pelvis and we're trying to get it to come into the pelvis, external rotation, meaning knees wide, is what we need to do to create space there. When the baby is passing through the middle part of the pelvis, then the asymmetrical movements like side lunges are great for creating more space there. And then as the baby is passing through the pelvic outlet or close to birth, then internal rotation, knees together, feet wide, can create space there. So we can use tools like pillows, peanut balls, birthing balls, blankets to create those shapes in the lower body to change where we're creating space in the pelvis, encouraging the baby to rotate into an occiput anterior or looking to the birthing person's back position and descend through the various levels of the pelvis, maximizing efficiency, shall we say, to try to keep things moving and flowing and avoid fetal malpositions that can really draw out the birth process.
And exhaust everyone. Even with an epidural, it could still be exhausting.
Absolutely.
Right. This is super helpful. And I just want to highlight again, all this can be, a lot of these positions can be done with an epidural. So I just like 100%. To kind of highlight that. All right. So I'm going to turn it a little bit back to you. What did you find as the most rewarding part of working bedside?
I think the biggest reward is that at the end of the day, a family has been created, and that can look 1,000 different ways. But it's ushering a family from what they were before to what they are after. And there was nothing more rewarding than having a birthing person who got the birth they wanted. And again, that can look 1,000 different ways, but just the look of accomplishment on their face and, really standing in their strength and their, empowerment at the end of it. And doing something that they probably at some point did not think they could, but they did. And getting to witness that, whether it's a life entering the world or a life leaving the world, and sometimes it's both at the same time. It's such a privilege, and it's such it's a place that very few people really get to stand on a regular basis. And just being a piece of that where I could make any part of it easier or more fulfilling or more peaceful or more loving, whatever it was, it never gets old. It just never gets old.
Yeah, no, I recognize that. What did you find the most frustrating thing?
Not being able to practice in the way that I wanted to practice because of a really kind of broken healthcare system and a focus on productivity over people, and a focus on being afraid of litigation more than really doing what the evidence says we should be doing. I didn't like being part of a system that I know is so inequitable for birthing people. And even though I did my best every day to not be part of that problem, nobody wants their life's work to be kind of associated with such a negative thing like maternal mortality and racial disparities, and birth trauma and obstetrical violence and a lot of the bad things that are happening. As much as the individual wants to be the change, it's a really big uphill battle. And that can be really kind of stifling on a professional and even a moral level. When shift after shift, you're kind of prevented from doing what you should be doing and from what you really want to be doing because you have to have your focus on so many other things at the same time.
Well, that kind of brings me to a question I was going to ask a little later, but I think I'll jump now. So what are some practices you saw in your 17 years as an L&D nurse that did change? And what are some practices you wish would change that haven't?
Okay, so we'll start with the positive.
Yes.
At least we're letting people drink now. That's great. We have some work to do. I would love for us to let people eat what they want. But at least we're allowing clear liquids now, which for the first 10 or more years of my practice was not a thing. I'm seeing more use of telemetry, so fetal monitoring where it's cordless, and so the restriction of movement is less. I'm seeing more openness to less traditional hospital births, so more in the way of water birth or natural birthing units that are kind of attached to a regular labor and delivery unit. I am unfortunately seeing less involvement of midwives, which is really disheartening. We are still seeing way more continuous fetal monitoring than we should.
I feel like that's increased.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've talked to some of my friends that are still active doulas, and they're saying that and inductions have actually, and again, this is just the New York City area I'm getting the feedback from, has increased.
Oh no, both. Absolutely. And I think that's countrywide. I think the last time I looked, it was like 83% of births had continuous electronic fetal monitoring, when really we should only be using that for high risk births.
And just for listeners, it doesn't mean that we don't have any. It's just a difference between continuous and intermittent. So still checking on babe, but
absolutely.
just not every second.
Not every single second.
Yeah, and evidence-based research actually says that should be the gold standard, like you said, for a non-high risk, or those that are not on epidurals or Pitocin, then they need to check on baby. But
outcomes are the same. So the high reliance on continuous monitoring and the downfalls that come with that in limitation of movement, and as the nurse constantly having to go into the room to adjust the monitor to get the baby back on, and up in your face and annoying you when I really don't want to be, but I have to be, that's a big frustration for me. Even just education on intermittent monitoring, most don't get it. They don't even know how to do it. They aren't comfortable doing it. And so that's why it typically isn't done as often, using a Doppler instead. Obstetric violence, absolutely have witnessed it. Lack of informed consent, absolutely have witnessed it. And I'll even say I've been a part of it. You do your best until you know better, and then you do better. And I've worked really hard to know and do better. But as a much younger nurse, I didn't know what I didn't know. I've seen everything from just not presenting all the options to cutting an episiotomy while telling the patient to her face that they weren't cutting an episiotomy, and everything in between. So that's a huge frustration for me.
Can I tell you this story? I think you have told you this before. I was with a client that was completely unmedicated, and they cut an episiotomy, and they did not ask her, and she was unmedicated.
Yep.
The scream that came out of her, not just mouth, her whole body, and the trauma her husband experienced from that. I still am in touch with this person. I don't know how that happened. They didn't ask. They didn't explain. They had assumed, because she was with a midwife and then an OB stepped in, there was an assumption that she was medicated and that it was okay to do it.
Even so, not okay. Never okay.
I know. When you say you witnessed it, it happens. It happens. And it is so unsettling.
Yeah. Just trying. And I want to also say there are lots of people out there trying to shift the paradigm. And there are lots of bedside nurses who are advocating on a level I haven't seen before. And maybe it's just because of, social media and being able to see the other fighters out there. But there are lots of people who are trying to change the culture. But any cultural change is slow and it's hard and it takes a really long time. And it takes people who are fighting status quo as lone wolves for a really long time. And so I don't want to, diss my peers in any way, because I don't think that most of this comes from a place of malice. I think it comes.
I agree.
It's ignorance. It's not knowing differently. It's maybe not understanding.
I don't think he went in to cause harm.
Right.
I think there was an assumption because that's the norm, and just went with that. I really don't believe it, but it had a rippling effect.
Absolutely.
Whether it was meant to. Whatever the intention was.
Yeah. And thinking, and knowing, honestly, if I'm very real with myself, knowing that I've been a part of somebody else's experience of trauma is horrifying to me.
Yeah.
But I don't think I was aware of that for a really, really long time in my career. And I don't think that was because I was intentionally blind to it. I just think it's a know better, do better situation. And, in a 12-hour shift where your nurse likely doesn't have time to eat a full meal, they don't get a break. They run to the restroom when they can. They're getting a sip of water here and there. Just to have the capacity to think, like, how am I emotionally supporting my patient? And have I listened to them? And, it can be a luxury, some shifts, when we all wish that was just the norm. So I don't want to diss my people at all.
No,
I think that most of us are doing our best. But we're coming in, and have been for decades, coming into a really broken, weird system, and change is slow.
So let's shift this to helping those that are coming in for their birth. So what is one thing you wish people realized about hospital births that had they known ahead of time, they may have been less frustrated or found the experience to run smoother? So is there something you're like, oh, I wish they knew this because it would just make things easier for them?
Inductions are not fast, period. That's my big one. I think sometimes the consent process for an elective induction is, hey, would you like to be induced? Yeah, sounds great. Okay, show up at this date and time. And so I can't tell you how many people have shown up for their induction with like their whole posse thinking this was going to be a 4-hour thing. And I'm like, oh no.
I guess it depends on where
1 to 3 days. It's your first baby, you're 39 weeks and your cervix is closed. This is a multi-day undertaking for most people in your situation. So elective inductions are just that. They're elective. They are optional. It is typically not fast unless your body is just really ready to go. So that would be one.
That's a really good one, because I remember bringing this up the other day. I'm like, oh yeah, you go in, depending on your cervix, Cytotec or Cervidil. And if you are slightly dilated, maybe the Foley.
Maybe.
And then eventually Pitocin. It could take a while. And I'm like, usually between, you might even have 2 doses of Cervidil or Cytotec. It could be
days.
Hunker down, get some good movies.
Yes. It's days, and like keep everybody at home until you really need them there. Because this is a long thing. So that would be one.
That's a good one.
The second thing I would say is you have a right to have every question you have answered before you give a decision on anything. And I think that people often think, well, I don't need to prepare because they all know more than I do anyway, and I'll just do what they tell me to do. And yeah, they probably do know more, maybe, than you do. But that doesn't mean that you don't have a right to an opinion. So you always have the right to ask as many questions as you need to. You're not bothering me. You're not annoying me at all. It's your right to have that information. The other thing that I would say is that, like, what you as a pregnant person need to feel confident and comfortable going into your birth is what you need. And that is wildly different person to person. But, have whatever baseline knowledge you need to feel comfortable. Make sure you have it before you go for your birth. Because like we've kind of alluded to, your experience could vary really widely. The experience level of your care provider and your nurse could vary widely. The culture in your hospital could vary widely. And those are questions that you can ask ahead of time too. Ask to tour the unit. Look up your provider's C-section rates. Look up your hospital unit C-section rates. Ask what will and will not be supported before you show up. Go over your birth plan with your provider before you get to the hospital so that you aren't in those sorts of conversations in the heat of the moment. Make your desires known, like as early in your hospitalization as you can with your care team.
I just had a thought pop into my head.
Yeah.
So you were you were bedside for 17 years. You probably saw a lot of doctors come and go. But say during just one typical shift, you're dealing with, I don't know, how many different doctors in one typical shift?
Well, it was different when I worked in Indianapolis than Cincinnati.
All right, let's say like a medium to big hospital.
Yeah, on a medium to big hospital with residents and med students and attendings and private docs and hospitalists, I could be working with 4 to 5 different obstetricians, plus a midwife or 2.
Okay, so let's just say like 5 to 7 people.
Yeah.
And did you notice how each of them, and maybe they all practice the same way, but where you have to like Dr. A, is going to be more lenient about this. Dr. B might push the pit a little bit more. Dr. C is going to be like however you want. So then that's challenging.
Yeah.
So you're juggling different ways of practicing and trying to support the doctor as well, like show up and not contradict the doctor. Or maybe you did. I don't know. I know you're pretty spicy. Sometimes. Maybe you did. Like actually, sometimes. I say that and I can see like, let's have a talk about this. But that must have been, so you're trying to support the person in labor and honor their wishes, as well as juggle the different personalities and trying to know how each care provider practiced. That's hard.
Yeah.
That seems really hard.
It's not always a comfortable place to be in when you're the advocate between what your patient desires and what your provider typically will do. I think as a birthing person, it's okay to ask your nurse, like, hey, I know so-and-so is coming on at this hour. I haven't met them before. Can you tell me kind of their birth philosophy? And I have straight up said to my patients before, so-and-so is coming on. Typically they get report on their patients and then they go room to room and start breaking water. And if you don't want your bag of water ruptured, you may need to specifically say that. And sure enough, that happened. And then what the patient chooses to do in that moment is up to them. But at least I've kind of said, hey, I know you don't really want this yet, but they are probably going to push it. But as a patient and the one who's giving birth, like, it's okay to ask those questions. And I can give an honest answer without throwing my provider colleague under the bus. But I can also go to my provider colleague and be like, I know you're going to want to do this, but like, she really doesn't want her water broken until she's in active labor. But she's really sweet and she may like feel like she has to do it if you bring it up. So can we maybe just wait until she brings it up to talk about rupture membranes or something like that?
How would that land usually?
Most providers would be open to it, but I will say not all. Not all.
Well, so we'll leave it on that. All right.
Yeah. Not all.
All right, we're going to take one more break. When we come back, what is one final tip or piece of advice you'd like to offer new and expectant parents? We'll be right back.
Love, exciting and new. Hello, Hannah Waddingham here. Have you seen the fabulous new Sun Princess? World-class entertainment, exceptional dining, and the greatest pizza ever. It's
Don't miss our Come Aboard sale with up to 40% off and free room upgrades. Visit princess.com or call your travel advisor to book. Princess Cruises. Terms and restrictions apply. Offer ends 2/28/25. Ships of Bermudan and British Registry.
We are back. So, what is one final tip or piece of advice you'd like to offer new and expectant parents?
That's such a hard one. I think ultimately foster a good relationship with your nurse. I think that, when people find out they're pregnant, they're really, really concerned about who is my midwife going to be and who is my OB going to be. And for sure, those are really important pieces of your birth experience. But generally speaking, your nurse is your best friend for those 12 hours. And fostering a relationship where you're honest with them and you respect honesty from them is important. If you're bringing a doula with you, that is awesome. I love that for you as a labor and delivery nurse, but sometimes that can be actually really intimidating for your nurse walking in, because sometimes the nurse can be kind of met with a confrontational vibe or a protective vibe, like I'm the bad guy and the doula is the good guy. And that's not a fun place for your nurse to be in either. Because really, the vast majority of us, we're on your team, and we want to be on the team too. So just fostering a really honest and open relationship with your labor and delivery nurse is really, really important, because you have no idea the battles they might be fighting for you outside of the room. But we have to know, and we have to be like on the inside to know what you want in order to fight those battles. And I would just say, like, again, whatever education you need to walk into your birth experience feeling comfortable and prepared, then do what you need to do to get it. There are lots of resources out there, some at little to no cost for birth education. Don't be afraid to ask for a unit tour. Don't be afraid to do your research. And if you are not vibing with your nurse, you absolutely have the right to ask for a new one. It doesn't have to be personal. It just could be a personality clash. This is your one and only chance to get the birth that you want. So don't be afraid to ask for what you need.
Oh, I really, really like that. Where can people find your work?
Well, I'm not wildly active on the social media.
Oh,
but,
I know.
I'm old, I guess. But if you Google my name, I'm literally the only one in the world with my name that I have found anyway. So things will pop up either through the university or LinkedIn or Spinning Babies or Yoga Alliance. I'm registered there as well. So if you Google my name, you can find me.
People can find your classes, your Spinning Baby classes.
Absolutely. Yep.
And your prenatal yoga classes.
Yep.
Yay.
I can easily be found.
Caitlin, I love talking with you. This kind of reminds me of that time we were stuck in, where were we?
Not
Richmond.
Asheville.
No, not Richmond. Charles. No, where were we?
Nope, it was North Carolina.
North Carolina. I don't remember. Somewhere in North Carolina in a snowstorm, and we were just having a drink and waiting for our planes and chatting and
hoping we would make it home that night.
Charlotte, North Carolina.
That's where we were.
Like, where were we? And I just love hanging and talking with you. So thank you for letting me pick your very knowledgeable brain.
Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely.
This has been an episode of Yoga Birth Babies, produced by Prenatal Yoga Center. You can catch us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Periscope. I'm Deb Flaschenberg. Thanks for listening.
In a world where single moms face countless challenges, the Single Mom Podcast offers a space of support and empowerment. Each episode offers stories of triumph, practical strategies, and heartfelt support to those on the journey of solo parenting. With a touch of humor and a wealth of inspiration, this podcast invites single moms everywhere to join a community that understands and uplifts. Discover the power of shared experiences and the strength of single mothers, because together they are truly unstoppable.